All right. Welcome everyone to Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark. Today's topic is let's talk about sex, baby. And Diana, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Brandy. So for those of you who weren't listening in the pre-show recording, we were just listening to the song, Let's Talk About Sex, Baby. And the reason I love to talk about sex is because it's one of those subjects that makes people squirm. And that's one of my specialties, is to raise subjects that people are uncomfortable with. So today I have a great guest, Lauren, who is also comfortable talking about things that make people uncomfortable. Lauren Dummett is a marriage and family therapist, and she specializes in areas of intimacy and helping families create joyful expressions. Would that be true?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I'm also a sex therapist, certified sex therapist and sex addiction therapist, which sometimes people think they collide, but to me, it's all inclusive. And I definitely think there's so many different expressions of self, and sex is a big one of them.
So let's talk about that. How do you and I discuss this in a way that doesn't make us want to snicker, right? I mean, we're all kids when it comes to sex in that way. There's a part of us that all wants to snicker and hide in the corner and make it dirty. And
Yeah,
maybe
it's
not
so
all.
funny. I was talking to someone recently, and they said some things that made me laugh and were so true. They were like, sex is so stupid. It's just so silly. We make such a big deal about it. Like, isn't it just like big kid play? And definitely different people have sex means different things to different people. And I think the reason it makes us snicker is because it's usually, and especially in our society, it's something that has been kept secretive, yet at the same time, it's everywhere, right? So it's like sex sells, the images are everywhere, and yet it's also at the same time infused with shame. And so I think people feel like this conflicting feeling inside, which then sometimes when we're nervous, we just snicker.
Right.
We don't know how to feel, so we just laugh.
Yeah. So I want to just back up a minute. What is the difference between a sex therapist and a sex addiction specialist?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I became a sex addiction therapist before I became a sex therapist. I would say that in being a sex addiction therapist, there's a lot of sex therapy included in that. However, I would say sex addiction therapists kind of get a bad rap in society, at least in this culture of society in the treatment field, from sex therapists, because I think there's an underlying belief that sex addiction therapists are sex negative, that we're pejorative and going out and labeling and making things wrong or bad. And I can't speak for everyone. There might be parts of the country where that is true. In my experience, people have come into therapy with a problem it's ruining their life or creating dysfunction in their life, and they want help with that. And as a therapist, always, I think it's important to listen to the client and what they want to work on and what is important for them, and then creating a treatment plan around that. However, I think it's possible to be a sex positive sex addiction therapist. But the reason I went on to then become certified in sex therapy was just to create more cohesion and just to kind of immerse myself in all sides. And I think, to be honest, I think they're more similar than people think. Really, it's just about creating a plan that works for you and actually not being judgmental. I think part of sex addiction work is actually about having a lot of compassion and looking at like what needs are not being fulfilled and how we try to get needs fulfilled through ways that end up hurting us.
So sometimes it's substance use, sometimes it's when I worked with a group of young women, they called it two-legged dope. Sometimes, right?
I love that. Yeah.
Sometimes it's actual dope and sometimes it's human dope. If we're using somebody as a coping strategy that doesn't involve, they would have called that two-legged dope.
Yeah. I mean, I heard once that someone say how all addiction is an intimacy disorder, and that just so resonated with me.
So
It's like,
explain
if
that.
you
Yeah,
ever hear any addict talking about their experience being an addict, they don't start with saying like, oh, I found this drug and it was so great. They talk about feeling not a part of, feeling like the world was here and they were on the outside. It's a feeling of disconnection and isolation, even among people. And so often with people that have addiction, they're turning to a substance or behavior to get their intimacy needs met and treating people as objects, which absolutely makes sense in terms of sex addiction, because I would say that the typical sex addict desperately wants to have intimacy, can't tolerate it, and then confuses sex with intimacy, and it's never filling that void. And so then it just becomes this compulsive search to get that void filled without really knowing how it is actually filled.
yeah. Wow. So it's the same void, just a different strategy to fill it.
Yeah, some people fill it with drugs, some people try to fill it with sex. I mean, process addictions are usually what we consider like behavioral addictions. But some people struggle with the term addiction because it's not like a physical dependence upon something. However, if you really look at the neuroscience and what happens chemically in the brain and the dopamine hit, that you can argue with that concept for sure.
I also wonder if, in fact, it isn't just the dopamine hit, it is oxytocin, right? So it's
Yeah,
even more
absolutely.
powerful than just a euphoric hit.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a rush of neurochemicals, and the oxytocin, I think, gives the false experience of
Of
intimacy.
intimacy,
Right.
right?
But it's not fulfilling. I think true
Not last a
intimacy,
few hours anyway.
yeah, I mean, I think true intimacy is really about being really vulnerable and I love that little, comparison, like, I let you in to see me. It sounds so cheesy, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
true. I mean, like, we connect through our humanity, and our humanity is flawed. And, don't we all just want to be perfect? But like, who wants to be friends with someone who's perfect? And it's in those things that we try to keep hidden that we actually connect with other human beings. And so I think sometimes that oxytocin gives us false sense of intimacy without actually having to be emotionally vulnerable.
Right. Sex is not necessarily equated with emotional vulnerability, right?
No, it can be, and I think,
Not necessarily.
but
Yeah.
it can be an act or it can be an emotional connection. And there again, I think it goes back to like what sex means to you, and I think if you look across cultures, it can mean so many different things. And
Mhm.
so, when my friend was saying that about sex is so stupid, we get so hung up about sex. Like, I think that's such a healthy attitude to have about it. Yet that's definitely an American attitude to have, or maybe European, Western, I shall say, because like I think in a lot of cultures, it is not about pleasure at all. It's about duty. It's about, function. It's about religion and sacrifice. So it just depends, on
Gee, that does sound hot.
Could
Right?
be.
Sacrifice, all of those things. I want to sign up from that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think however it is seen by you, it's also it's a full expression of self because it shows what your values are, how you look at it, right? So if it is a sense of duty, then duty is a value that is utmost importance to you, or religion, or whatever it may be.
Right. I get that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I do. I had a client once explain to me that her measure of a partner was the way they were in bed was a microcosm of how they were, like a little TV screen about how they were going to be in a relationship. If they were
This
very
has been coming up for me this week, like in
really,
hell.
is this
I've been working with this client and she's been in treatment. She's going back home and, she's been pretzeling herself into whatever her partners throughout her life. And I'm talking about relational partners have been wanting her to be. And what she's realizing now is as she's gaining more of a sense of self, she's like examining her relationship. and her partner, her husband, in this case, and father of her child, is a fire captain. He's not empathetic. He like tells her, you shouldn't feel this, you should feel this. And it's very much the dynamic has been about like power and control. And she finally just disclosed, like in their sexual relationship, it's all about his dominance, you know, his pleasure. He likes her to be on her knees, her to be choking, her to be in pain, him to be in control of it. And I don't say that to make him a bad person, but that dynamic absolutely shows up in the relationship where he makes her the identified patient. It's about her being in shame and essentially being on her knees.
Right.
Accept me, accept me, accept
Help
me.
me.
You
Help.
know, is this enough? Is this enough? Is this enough? Are you good? Are you good?
Yeah.
You know, and it's a snapshot. I was like, wow, the parallels are amazing.
So the client was really right.
Yeah, and she doesn't like any of those things sexually, but she's never had a voice. And again, it plays into her pattern of just doing whatever she thinks she needs to do to feel loved or accepted or
Right.
good enough.
So when you're working with, let's say, a traumatized client, because we
Mhm.
know that when you present in treatment, the odds of having some form of sexual trauma or sexual shaming, we can say, is almost universal.
Yeah, well, so as a trauma therapist, I probably see trauma more broadly. And one of my specialties, and especially working with addiction, is like developmental and attachment trauma. And so it might not even be sexual, but like that, those early relationships in terms of not getting our needs met create how we view ourselves and how we view our relationship to the world and other people. So I would say that some of the most damage is done in those early relationships in terms of self-esteem. And that sense of self-esteem often plays out in relationships, as well as, you know, another concept I like to talk about is eroticized rage. And I see that happen a lot in terms of people's pent up feelings of anger being acted out sexually. And sometimes those are very, very early dynamics.
Eroticized rage. So sexual proclivities, sexual preferences, sexual fetishes, all of these things can be developed long before somebody is aware that they're even sexual.
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, for example, with this client that I'm talking about, upon a further exploration, this man's mother was extremely invasive, intrusive, humiliating to him. So it makes sense that he wants to have power over, he wants to humiliate, he wants to be in control. And to me, it's a very clear expression of eroticized rage. Um, I have, I have a fetish. No, I have a like odd interest in like serial killers. And I always am like, what happened? Like I always want to know about like their childhood and like what happened. And you know, in the Night Stalker, I like watched the documentary and then I did my research and I was looking at like how as a child it like his family was extremely, his father was extremely abusive. He'd sleep in the cemetery to get away. But then he had this older cousin that was had he idolized, that went to Vietnam and came back and was showing him pictures of all the bloodshed and people he'd killed and women he'd rape, and he'd like hold their head severed above them after raping him. And he talked about this with the Night Stalker as the Night Stalker was like coming into puberty. And like I'm sure there was some fusion then of the sexual development and getting, you know, adolescents or adolescent males are turned on by everything, you know, so it becomes fused with violence and cruelty and torture. And so like of course I don't think he was conscious of that, but I can imagine that being a huge influence, especially if like the people he was supposed to trust, the people that were supposed to be his models, were also abusive. And so like I think people have a hard time understanding how that could ever develop, but that absolutely makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that often happens in the case of people that have become like serial sexual assaulters in some way.
Rage, eroticized rage.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't
Really
always,
right.
it's not
Yeah.
always bad either.
Right, right,
You
right, right.
know?
I'm not hearing bad. I'm just,
Yeah, I mean,
I look at
sometimes
all of this,
people
Lauren,
like, yeah,
on a continuum,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Between individual preference and desire and triggers and all of those things
Mhm.
to actual disturbing behaviors. There's a huge continuum there.
There's a huge continuum. Yeah. Just like sexuality. I mean, I think I work with so many young people that are so confused because they might have had an experience with a man and they're a man and they identify as Republican and Christian and, all of these things that they feel like they have a very straight shot of what their life should look like, but yet they have these confusing feelings. And I'm just using that as an
Yeah,
example of
yeah,
a sketch. But it's like there are people that are 100% gay and 100% straight, and then everything in between,
right.
And so I just think that there's so many cultural influences and messages that people can take in to feel like they're wrong or bad. And the truth is, it just is an expression of ourself. And I think that is, and when I work with people in recovery, to me, recovery means like really being able to live in alignment with your authentic self. And to me, I think that's what sexuality is about too. And then if we're looking at behaviors that are not serving us, then that might be something we need to work out psychologically that's manifesting that way.
Yeah, yeah. So I have a situation where when I was working in this women's group,
Mm-hmm.
I asked how many of these women had been what they would define as sexually assaulted or during their earlier, teenage years, almost universally raised their hand, whether that was a result of being intoxicated around unsafe situations or just their way of people pleasing. There was a host of reasons why people said that happened. But then I asked a question, how many had actually engaged in trading their bodies for money or drugs? And a whole bunch of those very same women raised their hands. And
Mm-hmm.
it made sense to me, but I would love for you to talk to us about why that would happen. Yeah.
I definitely don't want to make this a political conversation. But I just actually watched that film, A Promising Young Woman, that was so impactful. First of all, I thought it was so creatively done, and it was like just beautiful to watch in terms of the artistry of it. But it actually aroused so much anger in me, and it wasn't like it was an anger that felt empowering. And if I had to say anything about that, it felt like the words were, "I have a right to be angry," and and I say that because I think that women I don't know one person who hasn't experienced some minor form of sexual assault. And many, many, many people close to me that have had multiple experiences with that. And I had a male friend recently, maybe last year, who was, we'll say it was definitely sexual harassment at work. And he was outraged and filing a lawsuit. And to be honest, what he experienced by no means was it right, but it was minor, in my opinion, compared to what a lot of women have been through. And so I think it's something that like women haven't had a voice in terms of coming forward, because the truth is, many people say like, you have to speak up, you have to take a stand, you have to do this. And I feel like you don't have to do anything. Do what feels right to you, because so many women, when they make a stand, their whole life gets put on display. They get turned into a slut, their whole history, anything they've done, and it becomes about making it their fault or a character defect. And so it makes sense that people have a fear of coming forward.
Yeah.
And so at the same time, you can see why so many people have been silenced. And at the same time, I think sex has been monetized. It has become something to trade. And I think they're closely interconnected as well. as women realizing that they can either be like, sometimes they feel that being able to trade in that sense gives them power. But I also think that that's another form of eroticized rage. I think women often use sex to have power over, like, for example, many strippers. That's an example of eroticized rage because they were disempowered. They have anger towards men. They are enacting a behavior that allows them to be in control, them to have the power, them to feel like they're getting paid. And so I think that can be also another form of eroticized rage.
That makes perfect sense to me. I do see the empowering that comes with an eroticized rage. I get that sense because if sex is the ultimate potential to be vulnerable and to be seen and to be exposed,
Right.
and you're trying to preserve some sense of boundary between you and somebody else, I can see where that would be one tool. I'm not saying it's a healthy tool or unhealthy.
But also if we consider how many women have had to say to themselves, it's just my body, in terms of having been victimized in some way, I think it makes sense too how they can minimize like the impact of, it's just a body, it's just a tool at the same time. Yeah.
I'm going to ask a kind of provocative question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the very fact that we carry children and nurse babies very often makes us feel like our bodies are that anyway?
Oh my gosh.
We are vehicles, we are food, we are in lots of ways there for another human being in a way that men are not.
Yes. I have not birthed my own children. So I cannot speak personally, but I've also worked with mothers and infants like so much of my career. And, my mom just alone has always said having children is the ultimate sacrifice. It starts with morning sickness, and the ultimate sacrifice of your body is just a vehicle for this other human being. And even just like the hormones and oxytocin that are involved in suddenly this human being is so much more important than yourself. And so like talking about the ultimate selflessness and her always saying like it's a different relationship because your children will never ever love you as much as you love them, and that's just the natural order of things. But I've also heard so many women talk about how like you never appreciate your body until you have children, because if nothing than just the biological functions of what your body does and the miracle of that as well. So I think for some women, it feels like such a miracle that they get to do that. And at the same time, it can also just feel like a parasitic relationship in some way.
It is in service of another human.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every bite you take is in service of that other human. And I do think that shifts things for women.
It does. It does.
That makes perfect sense. All right. Brandy, do we have any questions? Do you have questions?
We have not had any questions come through the chat yet. So we can give our participants a couple minutes to chime in, but I can kick off the Q&A session, Lauren, with a question for you. So you mentioned earlier this contradiction between sex sells, but also being seen as a dirty thing. But there's also that dynamic between men versus women where guys can openly discuss their sex lives and women are sort of shamed for it.
Absolutely.
Could you delve into that dynamic a little bit and how or why women should feel more comfortable talking about sex more openly and freely?
Well, I think things are changing definitely in society. I think it is a layered question because I think you have to go back into history and throughout history how the roles of women have been changing. I just recently watched that film Them. I don't know if you've seen it. I felt so infuriated by that film, but it was also based on so much truth. It was about like gender inequality, race inequality. It was also a horror film. However, the actual events that were real were much more horrifying than the actual like
Or
kind of horror aspects of the film. And I think that was such a snapshot to me of a time period in which I was not born and didn't understand. It wasn't even that long ago. It was like the 50s. And so I think looking at the changing roles that women have played is important in having that, an underlying basis for that conversation. I think today there's a lot more equality, there's a lot more freedom of expression, but it's still a patriarchal society. But I do think that, women are becoming more empowered, there's more acceptance. And again, my experience is limited. I live in LA, right? I want to say that I am definitely not speaking for all parts of the country, which are sometimes not as progressive. But I think there's a lot more acceptance of, gay relationships and polyamorous relationships and transgendered relationships. However, it's still not the norm, and there's still a huge amount of, prejudice and judgment around that. But I definitely like that is one of the concepts that angers me, is that kind of double message about how, a man can be, and again, that comes up. I don't know if you guys have seen that movie, A Promising Young Woman, but it comes up where like, oh, you're such a cliche. You like killed the stripper on your bachelor night. Like, she's just this object, right? And that like, for women, the value has been to be like chaste and loyal, and and instead of a woman being able to be celebrated for having multiple partners, I think that's not something we generally see. And when we do see it, I think it's a huge controversy. I think there's so many people that sit in judgment of her being a slut and like objectifying herself, and instead of like maybe celebrating her sexuality. And it's still hugely divided. And I think that is an issue. And I think it will continue to evolve. I hope it'll continue to evolve. But I think there's been, I think in terms of evolution, you can actually go way back. And like, a woman was meant to protect her children, and a man was to spread his seed to procreate, and so I think I think those early kind of examples are so primitive. And I think if we're living in a progressivist society, that means we have to move away. Like, we are not cavemen. We are not just trying to survive here. We're trying to be fully self-expressed, right? So I think you have to look at it from like a cultural lens and a historical lens.
Absolutely. That's a great note to finish our dialogue on. We are no longer cavemen and women. We get to fully express ourselves, however that might be. Thank you, everybody, for joining us again for another episode of Collegial Conversations. And this will be on O'Connor Professional Group's YouTube station, where we get most of our watchers and listeners. But thank you again for joining.
Thank you so much for having me on. That was such an honor and so fun to talk with you as always.
You're welcome.